I think having Thompson and Shaw be the attacking storyline arc is about better than Hayes or I could have dreamed. I just think that this is a good encapsulation of maybe what we are going to see in roster management from Hayes, where she's looking at the overall player pool from the Ananovsky era, which, as we know, the Federation saw ultimately as a failure, seeing the quality in that player, but also understanding what they need to evolve and adapt and change and grow. And again, you expect the plateaus from a young player, but you do also need them then to respond to the plateaus by taking that next step. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. It is Friday, October 25th. We delayed taping slightly because we wanted to talk about the U.S. Women's National Team, and we are going to do that in depth. They get a win over Iceland on Thursday, begin the new era of the U.S. Women's National Team. We've got a lot to discuss. Let's dig in. So as we said earlier this week, we delayed taping just a little bit because we wanted to dig into the first U.S. Women's National Team of the October international period, which was played on Thursday night against Iceland in Austin, Texas. And go deep we will. There's a lot of actually really good stuff here. I was impressed by this game, both in the positive things for the United States and also I think a very quality amount of tape that I think they're going to take out of this game. First game since winning Olympic gold, part of this victory tour. They do end up winning this game 3-1 over Iceland. Alyssa Thompson, Jaden Shaw, and Sophia Smith score the 3 goals for the United States. Positive, we're just going to start with the result and then we'll dive into the performances. Obviously a positive result. They still have yet to lose a game under Emma Hayes, though I don't really hold her to that, especially going into this tinkering period with no major international tournament for the United States for a number of years. But it is notable that even as we sort of see the team evolve and move and stretch and change, I think that they play very well on home soil. It was interesting to see this team go out and do such a nice job. The starting 11 drew heavily from the Olympic roster, but we did also see some first caps. We saw some impact subs. We saw some players very close to the team's core, but maybe not necessarily an Olympic star get some very nice moments. Maybe to start, I will say that probably overall, and we're going to analyze all 3 of these games in this international break, but I'm going to feel probably pretty glass half full throughout this entire week when it comes to the U.S., barring any disaster or injury or anything like that. I don't think there is any result that is a disaster for the United States here. If they had lost this game, I think it would have been interesting for sure, but I don't have high expectations for quality because I do just think people might remember this, and I know a lot of pretty diehard U.S. Women's National Team fans listen to this show, that this period after a major international tournament is not usually the most productive for the United States in terms of tactics or player pool, right? Even if you don't just go back to the victory tours of the past, which kind of drag on. If you think about the goodbye games, even just last year, those goodbye games to Megan Rapinoe, to Julie Ertz, it's a big marketing play for U.S. soccer. If you watch this game, you saw that they were the branded gold water bottles. They had the big TV spot with the Olympic gold. It really was a celebration of what happened over the summer. And that isn't always super conducive to change or to, again, experimenting. But I actually think that this particular game did a nice job of balancing both of those things. The goodbye games I actually think are really important, but as people have discussed, and I think I've even said in the past, I'm a big fan of those goodbye games being games that those players don't necessarily play in, which we will also see. We'll see the goodbye game for Kelly O'Hara, for Alex Morgan, which is very much deserved. But the nice thing about kind of where the team is at right now with sort of that realistic look at what does it take for this team to grow and evolve, I think that Emma Hayes got that balance right on Thursday. If she can successfully get any analysis out of this game, tinker with some things, get new players involved, that's productive to me. So I don't have any real expectations on results. I think what I just would like to see are some slight changes. You want to see good things. You actually kind of want to see struggles. You want the team to continue to be exposed in certain areas of the pitch and grow from that. And I do think we got that in this game. There was no huge tactical shift or anything like that, but I think we did also see a team that was a little bit rusty. We saw them have to overcome that. And the stars of this game were probably almost better than what Hayes or certainly I could have drawn up as the team kind of looks to evolve through this period, through the trip to Europe at the end of this year and into that sort of January camp where they're expecting to have, youth players involved and the full team doing kind of this sort of futures camp, right? I think Thompson scoring her first international goal, really, really good to see. Jaden Shaw gets a tally after a frustrating summer with injury. We saw Sophia Smith make an immediate impact off the bench. But going back to this starting 11, Not surprising that it does rely very heavily on the Olympic roster. Like I said, Hayes is balancing two things right now. Thing number one is that these fans, like it's a business side of the soccer of it all, but these fans who buy these tickets want to see the Olympic stars. The US has marketed it as that. So the starting 11 very much relied on the Olympic roster. There was only one player in the starting 11 who was not at the Olympics, which was Alyssa Thompson. And we'll talk about her a little bit more in depth later. But just to kind of run down who we saw on the pitch to start, it was Alyssa Nair, Emily Fox, Naomi Girma, Emily Sonnet, Jenna Neiswanger, Sam Coffey, Rose Lavelle, Lindsay Horan, Mallory Swanson, Lynn Williams, and Alyssa Thompson. I think you saw where those absences were. It's possible that if the roster had been slightly different, you would have seen even sturdier people maybe in. Instead of Neiswanger, maybe you would have seen Crystal Dunn. Instead of Sonnet in, maybe you would have seen Tierna Davidson. Instead of Thompson, you probably would have seen Trinity Rodman. So you actually saw how some of the absences on the roster itself impacted this starting 11, where there was a little bit of change, a little bit of a new mix, a new group. I talked about this last week when the roster dropped, and I want to revisit some of the things that Emma Hayes said about Shaw and Thompson, because like I said, we had kind of this really nice new chapter in these players' careers on Thursday. And I think that it's a good example actually of Hayes' impact as an emotional manager and a mental manager, that these players played so well, in addition to seeing players really respond to the high expectations that Hayes has for them, which I also think is very productive in this time where players are fighting for a spot on this team. What she said about Shaw when the roster dropped, she says, that Shaw was very frustrated that she wasn't able to get on the pitch at the Olympics. That happened due to injury, as people might recall. She stayed with the team the entire time, but she did not actually play in the Olympics. But Hayes says, what a teammate she was during that period, and I was very hopeful she would make it back, but it wasn't the case. I think she's recovered from her injury. She's in a good rhythm. We certainly saw that coming off the bench on Thursday. And then on Thompson, I just think this is a very impact quote, so I keep repeating it. She says about Thompson, I spoke with her when she did come into camp as a training player, and she understood what she needed to do. And I've really appreciated her sort of living up to her own expectations for herself and demonstrating the behaviors and the performances that she wanted to see from herself. This is a really interesting test case to me in terms of Hayes' overall management, because this is a player that she inherited from the Vlatko Andonovski era. People might know, right, that Thompson was a relatively late addition to that group that went to the World Cup. She was very young. She was only 18. It signifies, the fact that she hadn't actually scored at the international level until Thursday. This is a player in the player pool that Hayes inherited. And it was actually kind of clear from some of her comments after this game that she thought that Thompson was maybe a little bit early, or she was a little bit young for that 2023 World Cup, and the understanding of how you have to manage a player that is going to plateau and then grow due to their age, right? She says, her international career started at a very early stage. That's why I believe it does take time. Maybe she wasn't ready before, but I can see from tonight's performance here that she offers a lot for us going forward. And I was super pleased for her goal and performance. And she actually, she credited the strike as well. She says, it's not an easy goal, drop in from the left-handed side and roof it in the top corner, which is true. I mean, people noted online that it was like shades of Kristen Press. It felt like shades of Sydney Leroux. It was a really, really nice goal, as Thompson had been scoring at the NWSL level really consistently for the last, month and a half, which got her back on Hayes' radar. I just think that this is a good encapsulation of maybe what we are going to see in roster management from Hayes, where she's looking at the overall player pool from the Andonovski era, which, as we know, the Federation saw ultimately as a failure, not getting a gold medal in the Olympics and also not making it out of the round of 16 at the 2023 World Cup. Seeing the quality in that player, but also understanding what they need to evolve and adapt and change and grow. And again, you expect the plateaus from a young player, but you do also need them then to respond to the plateaus by taking that next step. And also Hayes, I do think, is balancing this idea that the standards have to be even higher than they were under Andonovski. There does have to be a mental shift from within the team. She talked about, the pain well, the cave that they go into to get this Olympic gold. She wants that from the bubble players as well. And so I just, again, really nice example of how I do actually think Hayes is a good mental match for this team, where Hayes sets very high expectations. But what we know about these players who want to play for the U.S. Women's National Team is that they crave that. They crave high expectations, and they crave that structure, and they like being challenged, and they respond really positively to it. Like, that is the ethos of a successful player for the U.S. women's national team. Thompson's very active from the beginning of this game. The team themselves look a little bit rusty. This was not a perfect performance from the United States by any means. I, as someone who has covered the team for a while, am always just like, it's the first game. It's been a long NWSL season. They haven't seen each other since the Olympics. It's not going to be great. Well, they'll adjust. They'll be better in the second game. But I didn't overreact to that too much because it is expected. But again, I also find it interesting to watch the team have to problem solve. Like, it's not necessarily bad for plan A not to work as well, because again, that's how you learn, that's how you grow. In possession, the team was more of like a 4-2-4-2. The front line of Smith and Thompson and Williams, it wasn't quite as structured as maybe we saw in the Olympics. I don't know if that was changes actually put together by the coaching staff, or if it was just simply the fact that they were getting a feel for each other again. The game was pretty end-to-end from the very beginning. I really like Iceland as an opponent. They matched the United States physicality. They had 17 fouls in this game. That is a lot of fouls. They moved the ball quickly. I think the thing that let Iceland down in this game was actually mostly just finishing, but they got into dangerous places pretty consistently throughout this match, and I think that was really useful, again, to see where the United States got exposed. I'm sure they'll be very happy that they were also able to get the result, but the fact that you were playing a team that can match your physicality, move the ball very fast, get into very dangerous places, and expose your defense and your midfield while also not quite punishing you, and maybe that's the final piece for Iceland. Really, really good matchup. Hayes actually noted the physicality element, which I also think, again, as we move further into this era of her implementing her messaging to the team, I thought it was an interesting note. After, again, the U.S. had been accused under Andonovski of kind of losing some of that mental edge or losing that physicality edge that they had in the past. Hayes said after the game, she said, it was a physical team. Sometimes I want us to win the fight first. And there's parts of that I didn't particularly like from us, and I'll address that. I think that's a good note, where even if things aren't always clicking, if you're not always connecting in the best way, win the fight, win the mental part first, and then move on. Thought that was, again, a great note from Hayes. Keeping a standard high, expecting the team to be particularly locked in, even if it's a friendly, even if it's a celebration, right? Even if you're tired from the long NWSL season and you hadn't seen each other for a while. Liked that note from Hayes. But then also, again, you see the rustiness, you see the sloppiness. The U.S. struggles to completely implement Hayes' press super well. You can see Hayes is a very good defensive coach, and I'm just so fascinated to see how she's able, with limited time, to implement some of the pressing structure that she would like to see the U.S. use in the future, where you don't have as much time as she had at Chelsea. I think we saw, again, and you really struggle with this, moving from being a very good club coach to struggling at the international level. The defensive structure has always been one of the United States' strongest suits, and certainly has been true under Hayes. The equalizer that they gave up in the first half of this game was only the third goal that they've conceded under Hayes. It's a good defensive structure, but again, you saw how the team got stretched. I actually thought Alyssa Nair had an interesting night. She had to come off her line a lot. You don't usually see Nair doing a lot of kind of running off her line. That was actually a criticism of her in the past. I thought she did actually a pretty nice job being pretty commanding back there when Iceland did a good job of getting in behind. But she only did that because things got stretched, right? You saw on the equalizer that the U.S. midfield was rendered static once again. I think, again, that's the biggest criticism probably coming out of the Olympics, and the biggest thing that Hayes is going to have to address and adjust without, again, losing the ethos of the team. Iceland outshot the U.S. in the first half. They were arguably the more disciplined defensive side. They played off ball, a very similar style to we've seen how other teams have played the United States in 2024. They just sat off ball. They were very disciplined defensively, and it took impact subs in the second half to put the U.S. ahead after the game was at 1-1. A lot here for the U.S. to take away about both how the starting group struggled to break that defensive block down, and again, how they were rendered inert when Iceland was taking the ball the other way. The U.S. is a killer team when the game opens up. We know that, right? We saw that in the Olympics. It's why it took extra time to get those results at the Olympics. It's why you saw a lot of 1-0 score lines, right? But teams aren't going to let that happen if they can help it. And I do think that's just the constant struggle and difficulty of managing a team like this, or wanting the U.S. to be feared, to be tactically feared, to be a team that is on the front foot, is how do you break down a disciplined defensive side? And I think that if international managers across the world knew how to do that consistently, they would love to hear about it, because I think that just is the question in international football a lot of the time. The second half subs are impact subs for a reason. Shaw coming in for Haran, I thought was very interesting. We've had long discussions on this show and beyond about the best fit for Jaden Shaw with the U.S. Women's National Team. She's played left winger for them a number of times. She's been encouraged, I think, to drift centrally while playing that left winger role. She can play as that false nine. Sometimes, again, she kind of plays both. Coming in for Haran is really important. She came in at the number 10 role. And as we know, Shaw can be an incredible playmaker. And the goal that she scores to put the team up 2-1 is a really good reminder of what she can do in a central position with the ball at her feet in tight spaces. If you look at the way she circumvents the Iceland defense to get that shot in, it's kind of a crasher on goal, but what she was able to do to actually get into that space was pretty incredible. People know that Shaw has a futsal background. She's really good at that one touch, that dribbling ability. She's a fabulous playmaker. I wonder, her not being fit this summer was a setback in her international development. I mean, it's hard to kind of, gloss over that. Like, that was an important missed opportunity. But I do think if she can stay on the field in terms of health, I'm not sure she's going to be immediately looked to displace the attacking trio, that triple espresso that the U.S. feels so good about. I think she might be vying for a midfield role. And I know we always talk about the United States' depth at attacking midfield, which they certainly have if you look at individual quality players, right? But you also see how the midfield in the United States is the one that we consistently kind of point out as having some of those defensive issues or ball progression issues, especially in a very physical game. Just interesting to see Shaw come in for Haran and what that means for the entirety of the U.S. midfield going forward. But also, not overthinking it, but I just thought her impact was very clear. And then Smith comes on to make it 3. Smith building her minutes. She played a bit for Portland last weekend, played a bit for the U.S. here and looked very good. So the overall takeaways are, the U.S. looked rusty. They looked sloppy. They're going to have some tough tape to watch when Iceland got moving the ball. A million good reasons for that to be true, for them to be looking the way that they did. Like I said, I'm not overreacting to that too much. I think having Thompson and Shaw be the attacking storyline arc is about better than Hayes or I could have dreamed. Those are the exact players that you want coming into a camp immediately after a gold medal win and performing, whether it's Thompson, who is getting herself back into the U.S. Women's National Team picture, whether it's Shaw, who's coming off again a frustrating fitness element to her Olympic journey, turning the page on the Olympic squad while also not, having to go crazy and pull people up with no experience. I think the midfield being a question mark again isn't necessarily a bad thing in this particular period, because I think eventually it will push the coaching staff into finding answers rather than just having those questions. And we got some new caps, right? We saw Yasmin Ryan get in. We saw Hal Hirschfeld get into the game for the first time. Very productive game. So great. All well and good. They play again on Sunday. I did want to answer a couple questions that were asked in the YouTube comments about when the roster dropped. A couple quick ones. People noticed the absence of Catarina Macario. I think it's relevant, again, watching Shaw come in and do so well, seeing the team, again, just kind of slowly evolve post-Olympics. It feels like Hayes is very much challenging Macario to return to serious minutes at the club level before she can be relied upon for the U.S., which, as we know, is a tragedy with the potential of what Catarina Macario can do, but also I think a very fair assessment of where she's at this time. Her having to pull out of the Olympic roster. I know that it was discussed as how it was a different thing than the knee injury before, and it was just a tweak, but you have to be relied upon. And when you have other players like the U.S. does and the depth that the U.S. has, she has to be able to consistently put serious minutes in for Chelsea, I think, before she's going to get brought fully back into the United States fold. And then there was a question about not seeing U20 players on this roster, the players that did so well at the U20 level at the World Cup. Hayes specifically said last week when the roster was announced that despite she has many of those players on her radar, she watched the whole U20 World Cup, she has many thoughts about those players as part of the future of the team. She didn't want to overwork them by giving anyone a full team call-up so soon after that tournament. So that's going to be pushed to January. So I don't think that not having any of the U20 players on this roster is an assessment of quality. It was more an assessment of timing and how they wanted to handle this particular window and probably the Europe trip before calling any of those people up in January. So looking ahead to Sunday, it's game 2 against Iceland. I expect the U.S. to be more organized. I expect them to have their feet under them a little bit more after training for a couple of days. I do want to see rotation, and I think this goes against Hayes' initial instincts. Hayes, it sounds like, is a big chemistry coach, fairly natural from someone coming from the club game. You can actually see it weighing on her brain a bit when she sees mistakes. She does note that, it'd be great if these players were always able to build chemistry, and that is how they won that Olympic gold medal, but this is not the time for it. So I do hope that she actually leans in and we see some serious rotation. I do think maybe you want to see that physicality boost, winning that fight first, kind of the way Hayes put it. But I think it's more that you just want to see the U.S. look a little bit mentally sharper in other parts of their game. You want them to be smarter in defensive transition, to be able to get stuck in, to have their positioning be better, to be able to problem solve better when they are holding onto the ball and retaining possession as much as they did on Thursday. I think that those things are more important to me than actually, quote unquote, winning the physicality battle, because I just don't think the game getting chippy on both ends is good either. And then particular players I'd like to see, obviously would love to see Ashley Sanchez at the international level again. I think a number of our commentators noticed that, maybe what they would like to see is a little bit more on the defensive side from Sanchez. And I think I completely agree. As we know, that's very important. Also, that's where the U.S. got exposed in this particular game. Would love to see it. Would love to see Haley Mace get some experience, maybe Sears. Hayes is going to have to allow some mistakes to be made, again, for these games to remain productive. And so I don't mind. I think heavy rotation, let the cracks get exposed, right? Let these players kind of sink or swim. I think that they are ready for this. And I think that, again, you get that first game out of the way, you get the big win, you celebrate the gold medal, and then the work continues. So I felt really good about this game. I like I said, I liked the positive play, but I also sometimes like the mistakes, especially in this particular period, because that's what makes you better. And then real quick, a final note. So we're going to go to NWSL just for 1 second. We're not going to talk about teams or games or play or anything, but I want to talk about kind of the big discussion moment for NWSL this week as they are in their international break. Salute to the Summer Cup, but this is a little bit of a break for a lot of these NWSL teams, as we saw another major NWSL rebrand this week after the sort of disastrous Boss Nation rollout the week before. The Chicago Red Stars, who, as people know, were a founding member of the NWSL and whose branding actually went back to just before NWSL, they are rebranding from Chicago Red Stars to Chicago Stars FC. A whole new crest. They pull the red out of the name. They add FC. The marketing is an element here. The new ownership is an element here. I just wanted to take a second because I've covered the Red Stars. I'm based in Chicago. I have been a fan. I was a fan of the Red Stars first, probably dating to like late 2015 on. I started covering the team remotely in 2018. I've been a credentialed media member since 2019. So I've been there for a little bit with the Red Stars, and I like the discussion. I'm going to provide a little bit of a counterpoint because I think a lot of good stuff has been written about some of the futility of rebrands and the corporatization of some of these teams as they grow and change, and the struggles to actually make an identity in the NWSL, and how they're losing something significant, and how the fear is that it's at the whims of ownership, and you don't want to lionize ownership, and all of these sorts of things. But my counterpoint to all of that, and this is my take on the Red Stars rebrand, is I think sometimes with the Red Stars, I struggle differentiating maybe what could be with what is, because the Red Stars are a team, again, historied team. They have had incredible rosters in the past. They are consistently in the postseason. They've played in a couple NWSL championship games. They've had some of the greatest players of all time walk their halls. And that is who the Red Stars have been to the NWSL. And people like the branding. They, and I think there was a lot of arguing about, what is in the word red? Does it matter? And all of these different things. And I think what I've always struggled with, especially kind of post 2021, where we saw a lot of things be exposed about the Red Stars, is I struggle with, yes, all of those things are true, but there was always this other truth with the Red Stars, right? About how they play in Bridgeview and they're very, very difficult to reach, right? Or about how ownership was not keeping up their end of the bargain in terms of spending in the team, about how concerns about the coaching staff were washed away, about how players had bad experiences at the Red Stars. Really good players had really bad experiences at the Red Stars. And there were moments, I think people kind of forget, I think you always heard from the league that, yes, there will always be an NWSL team in Chicago. We know Chicago is a really important market. It's a founding market, but they didn't have those solutions until this new ownership group came in, led by Laura Ricketts, who, as people know, her family owns the Chicago Cubs. And I remember conversations where that sale was kind of in flux from old ownership to new ownership, of people talking about all of those adverse issues with the Red Stars, about Bridgeview being a problem location, about how the team is in distress, and about how many resources are going to have to go into the team to make them competitive again, and how players don't want to play there, and about, all of these different things, and how reputationally, how do you rebuild that reputation? And what I heard sometimes was, I was like, yeah, no one wants to leave Chicago, but everyone feels like Chicago is this impossible situation at the same time. And so when a solution was presented, which was this Laura Ricketts led ownership group, I think pretty much from the get-go, I was like, there are going to be some concessions here. This is what happens when ownership comes in and saves a team in distress. A rebrand is like one of those things that happens. You're going to see an owner want to put their stamp on something that does represent something important to fans, but also represents failures in many different ways. You're going to see ownership want to come in and change that. I don't have strong opinions about the new crest. I don't really have strong opinions about the change of the name. I roll my eyes sometimes when people say we need to put FC into the name of a team because that's how people know it's a soccer team, or as people were joking about, some of the verbiage of the crest was like the soccer ball represents soccer, all of that, it is what it is. I don't think that these things are determined in real time. I think that they are determined over time. But I did actually talk to Red Stars CMO Kay Bradley about this rebrand and, chief marketing officer, so take it with a grain of salt. But what we talked about a little bit was how a rebrand maybe actually represents those changes that the Red Stars are trying to make. I think Sandra Herrera has made this point. I think maybe Meg Linehan has made this point, that you have to think of a rebrand like this as one step. And this is what Kay Bradley said to me. She said, as the club started to evolve and we started to see this positive upward momentum that we've seen over the past 12 months since Laura took over the club, it felt like now is a good time to make that transition, to signal a change that's already occurred, but also where the vision for the club is moving forward. And I kind of pushed her on that a little bit, because I think you hear a lot with these teams that have had such trouble in the past that they say, we're doing things behind the scenes. We're doing things behind the scenes. And I said, how do you convey those changes, the real material changes that fans really care about, to a fan base? And she says, we've been talking a lot about what are those changes that are happening behind the scenes. The leadership changes obviously is an obvious one. We also had the Wrigley match where they broke the NWSL attendance record. We had new coaching staff, new GM. We have new player acquisitions. We're now in the playoffs, which is really exciting. So we're having all of these moments. And that was exactly the conversation that we had, which was, okay, we've had some of these successes, and we're not naive to think that we don't have a lot of work ahead of us. We have just begun our journey, but we did want something that could signal that change out into the marketplace. And as much as I maybe have mixed feelings about the implementation of that, I do respect that perspective from the Red Stars. They have a lot of work to do still. The material things, right? Maybe winning a trophy for the first time in club history, moving out of Bridgeview into the city of Chicago, actually making those inroads to connecting with the soccer community here, which frankly, they just have really struggled to do. And you don't do that by changing a name. But I also understand why a name change comes with it. And that's kind of my piece as someone who very seriously was concerned a number of years ago that this whole thing in Chicago was not going to work out. So that's kind of my piece on the Red Stars. Not trying to be too apologetic about all of it, because I think a lot of the conversation about rebrands themselves and what they mean to fans and what you're losing in doing them and all these different things are very important. But I have a soft spot in my heart for the Red Stars, and always will. And I suppose will for Stars FC. But as I said before, as long as I've got a name of a city and a noun, I'm okay. So I hope that maybe people can give this one a little bit of time, because I do understand where it came from. So this has been today's edition of The Late Sub. I am your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton for getting up on a Friday morning and doing this with me. We are going to be hitting the recaps on the other 2 U.S. Women's National Team games. We've got a whole host of probably NWSL, WNBA off season. There's so much going on right now in women's sports. It's a very exciting time. But right now we're focused on international soccer, and I couldn't be happier, because as I keep saying, I love analyzing this team, and I cannot wait for you guys to go on that journey with us next week.